By popular demand, I'm going to be doing a presentation on the U.S. Election. I'm going to try to identify some of the dynamics that are going to shape its outcome. I'm going to explain some of the basic elements of the U.S. electoral system, particularly to Canadians that might not be familiar with the niceties of this system. And I will also look back over 20 years of history to identify some critical events that might shape the outcome of the election. For Canadians, there's a lot at stake. For a country that cannot defend its frontier, in a way, Canadian sovereignty exists at the sufferance of the United States. The only way we can protect our country is through U.S. military power. But this also means that our sovereignty is contingent on the goodwill of Washington. Pierre Trudeau described the U.S.-Canadian partnership as a mouse sharing a bed with an elephant. And this describes, of course, the relative size of Canada's population economy relative to the United States. When the United States catches a cold, Canada catches a flu. And it's one thing to share a bed with an elephant. It's another thing to have to share a bed with an angry gorilla. So what happens in Washington and in this next election is very consequential. I would argue it's the most consequential election in most people's lifetime. Now, most Canadians probably have the view that in the last 20 years, the American political power has been split between Democrats and Republicans. But it's important to point out that since 2000, there's only been one Republican candidate that actually won a plurality of the popular vote. The Republicans did win 3 presidential elections, or 2 and an asterisk, because the 2000 election was actually given to Bush by the Supreme Court when they stopped a recall in Florida that would have given Gore the presidency. When you look at the overall numbers, however, the popular vote tends to be in the last 20 years pretty close. There's not wild swings. Usually presidents are winning by 4 or 5 percentage points. So President Obama, who won a near landslide, only won 52.5% of the vote. And when we look at it geographically in terms of the states that are being carried, there's also a lot of continuity. Certain states are Democratic, certain states are Republican, and there's only a few states that tend to swing one way or another. When it comes to choosing a president, the Americans do not have a direct system, or what we would even call a democratic system. Instead, it's a kind of representative system. This goes back to the very birth of the nation and the constitutional system in 1789. And what this indirect system basically means is that people vote for electors who choose the president. Now, in general, those electors respect the vote of the people that in the states from which they were representative. However, there is no obligation of that elector to follow the sentiment of the people. And there have been some instances in the past where that elector has defied the popular will and made his own selection. Now, the reason for this system is because the founding fathers didn't put a lot of faith in the uneducated masses. They wanted to have this learned elite that could exercise judgment to prevent a disastrous choice. However, in the 20th century, this idea seemed very outmoded and elitist. Although there has been certain instances where electors, at least in the primary, debated not honoring the vote that they had been sent to make. Now, there's another more important consequence of this electoral system. Since presidents are not voted directly by popular vote, they are voted by these electors. And the amount of electors is actually very skewed. The system is very simple. For every congressperson and every senator, that is an electoral vote. Now that seems representative, but it actually favors very small states like Wyoming, and it disadvantages large states like New York and California. So in California, 700,000 voters only appoint one elector, whereas in Wyoming it's 195,000 voters. So the electoral power of a Wyoming voter is over 3 times that of a voter in California. Because there's a lot more small states, and those tend to be rural, it means that the Republicans who draw on these rural voters have an electoral advantage in the math. And this is distorted to a degree by gerrymandering, that very wealthy corporations and think tanks have gotten together to finance elections at the state level over decades of time, to the effect that even in democratic states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, there's a surplus of Republicans in Congress versus Democrats. Now, if you add all the electoral votes together, it takes 270 electoral votes to win. 269 is a tie. So that is really what the battle is to. You might hear this expression on election night, 270 to win. As you're watching on television, the votes come in by time zone. There's really 3 main time zones. There's one in Maine, which sometimes reports earlier, and of course it goes all the way to Hawaii, which usually everyone's in bed by then. Usually by the time it gets to the mountain states, if the election is clear, it gets called between 10 and 11 p.m. And the media will generally, when their models suggest that the victory is in hand, they'll make that call unless it's too close to call, like in the case of 2000. Now, when it comes to actually tabulating the vote, this is a very long process. There's over 10,000 precincts in the United States. There's many provisional ballots by people that needed to have their information verified. There's mail-in ballots, which are valid if mailed in, if it's postmarked by the election date. So it could take a week or 2 to even come in. So in very contested elections, these mail-in ballots sometimes become the difference. Now, there's obviously a process by which the vote is certified. This is done at the state and the county level. Once the state has certified the results, which can take over a month because of all the reasons that I was just explaining, then their votes are sent to Congress and they're counted out, and then the victor is formally acknowledged in law. Now, there's obviously some major differences in the American system from the Canadian system. The Canadian system is a parliamentary system, so the winning party would appoint the prime minister, which becomes the prime executive. In the United States system, the congressional vote and the presidential vote are separate. So that's one major difference. But I would say the primary difference that's important to understand is the intensity of the electoral cycle in the United States. Since the Supreme Court Citizens United ruling in 2010, basically there was an unlimited amount of money that became vested into the American political system. I could spend 20 minutes explaining this and why this is a really bad idea, particularly with this dark money. But there's significantly longer political campaigns. and there's just so much more money involved. So in addition to the political parties, which are spending a lot of money for the president and various Congress people, there's also all these private interest groups that form what are called political action committees, which enables them to advertise on various issues. Now, they might be advertising things like gun control, but usually they're not just talking about issues, they're also pretty much insinuating, without doing it directly, who they want you to vote in for president. So if you're in a swing state like Michigan, even 4 months before the November election, you get inundated with all these television ads, radio ads, print ads to sway the election. A presidential campaign is no longer 3 months after the convention. It's become essentially a 2-year event. It begins well before the primary system opens in the Iowa caucus in January. It goes through all the states. Then there's the convention, and then there's the main event, the 3 months that we're in right now. If you're turning on the news and are hearing expressions like blue state, red state, or purple state, these are conventions that emerged really just in the 21st century. A blue state is generally a term which is used for a state which tends to vote Democratic in presidential elections. A red state is a name for a state that tends to vote Republican. It also tends to be synonymous with a political philosophical difference between liberals and conservatives. So the purple states, also sometimes called swing states, are those which commonly can swing between one side or the other. These purple states have gone to both Democrats and Republicans in various elections since 2000, although some of them are more swingy than others. It's very important to understand that although our solidly red and blue states, in a way, this obscures the more fundamental division in the United States between urban metropolitan areas and particularly remote rural communities. So there tends to be a very strong polarization between conservatives and liberals in these two sides of America. And in general, what makes a state red is that there are a larger percentage of rural voters, and what makes a state democratic is having more cities, particularly larger metropolitan regions. Even in very red states like Texas, there are areas like Austin and Houston that are extremely democratic. By that same token, in California, in the Central Valley, even though it's a strongly democratic state, there are places that are extremely conservative. There's even a secessionist movement in Oregon, Washington, Idaho that resembles the Wild Rose Party in Alberta. In the last 20 years, there has been a transformation of the U.S. Electorate. In general, the electorate has become more diverse. So whites as percentage of the population by 2020 was just at that kind of 2/3 threshold, 66.7%. The electorate is becoming more educated, and people are becoming more secular. Now, that may have escaped you if you hear all this kind of religious rhetoric. But in general, even though evangelicals are very influential in the political system, the share of voters that are religious is steadily going down. Now, since 2000, the United States has been very polarized, and I would really trace this back all the way to Newt Gingrich and his contract with America, and the Republican Party's adoption of these kind of extreme populist tactics. In general, though, this polarization means that America is increasingly divided into two camps. And in part, this is due to a lot of dark money coming into the political system. One of the things that Thomas Frank recounts in his famous study, What's the Matter with Kansas, is because the Republican Party and corporate elites are so represented in the policy agenda, the neoliberal policies promoted by the Republican Party. They could no longer appeal to a very wide voter base. So rather than presenting an economic agenda, they decided to make a shift to cultural politics. And this is the beginning of the culture wars, in which they essentially argued that their political opponents were no longer American, and that they were elitist, and they were no longer respecting traditional American values. So for about 30 years, the Republicans have used this cultural wedge strategy relatively successfully, particularly in rural areas where the economy has really been left behind by globalization and certain technological trends. The economic alienation of these voters, which are also demographically trending mostly white, means that this type of populism really resonates with them. At the same time, the polarization of the Republican Party has also led to polarization on the Democratic side, increasingly identifying with multiculturalism and a vision of America that is out of sync with a lot of the values that were predominant in the United States maybe 30 or 40 years ago, and still predominant in rural counties today. Now, there's a whole dimension of a lot of dark money to finance this politics of resentment. I can't go into all the details of it. But essentially what we're talking about is, in the United States, there are essentially two camps, and there's very few voters left that swing back and forth. In these two camps, people are often getting their news, their media, their opinions from social media or corporate media, and they're no longer existing in the same factual universe. So this polarization is an extreme test for democracy, where either side looks at the other party as illegitimate and a threat to their way of life. Now, given this high degree of polarization, what it essentially means is that Harris has 226 electoral votes, which pretty much any Democratic president is going to win. Trump has 219 electoral votes, which are almost guaranteed for him with a 90% probability. And in between, there's only 7 swing states which they are really battling for. Now, they're in various sizes. Pennsylvania is the largest, Nevada is the smallest. We should also talk about Maine and Nebraska that have a unique system because the electoral vote goes by congressional district. So to get to 270 as opposed to 269, the Democrats under some scenarios have to win the Omaha district of Nebraska, and the Republicans need to win the rural 1st district in Maine. But in some sense, the road to 270 is then a math of these swing states. What combination gets you to 270? Harris has an advantage right now, but for many of these swing states, the polls are extremely close, and they're even within the margin of error, so they could potentially go to either player. So who are the swing voters then in the United States? You might have heard the term independent voters. All that means is that they're not affiliated to some political party like Democrats or Republicans. And actually, the independent voters are now a majority in the United States. Traditionally, the Democrats have been the larger party, but this doesn't prevent Republicans from winning the presidency or Congress, because Republicans tend to turn out more to vote, and Democrats tend to be less loyal to their party or more willing to vote for a Republican. The trend towards independence is largely because people don't want to be put in one particular box. But even though they're independent, you shouldn't think of these independent voters as swing voters. In fact, most of these independent voters are former Democrats or Republicans, or their whole life have voted either Democrat or Republican without ever shifting. It's just that they don't want to be identified as being one thing or the other. So who are the undecided voters? In an election like this one, the undecided voters tend to be people that aren't very political, tuned into the media, often working very hard, often working class. And they simply are undecided because it's still 3 months before the election, and they don't have enough information on which to make their decision. There's a few other characteristics as well. In terms of the undecideds, the only undecideds that actually matter are not the undecideds in 43 states, which are either red or blue. It's only in those 7 swing states that the undecideds really matter. And they're very small given the polarization. One of the things that really characterized many recent U.S. elections, whether it was a 2000 election with Trump and Hillary, where many people hated both candidates, and essentially in the last week they decided who they were going to vote for or who they hated less. This was a similar dilemma that was with Biden and Trump. One of the things that happened when Harris replaced Biden is that these double haters started to come back to the Democratic Party, setting up a very close election. Now, when it comes to where these sides are ultimately going to come in, it kind of depends. One of the things that's very critical that both candidates tried to do in the debate is they tried to depict their opponent as the incumbent and that they were the candidate for change, because people are unhappy because of the economic situation, because the income polarization, the high degree of inflation that pours groceries out of people's reach, makes rent hard to make. So in that sense, people are dissatisfied, so both candidates are trying to present themselves as the vehicle for change. You also have issues voters, whether it's abortion, gun ownership. These are issues that sometimes voters are single issue voters. That is the issue that's going to send them to the ballot box. Most voters, though, although they do have strong views on one particular issue, that's not the only thing that's going to determine their vote. One of the things that political scientists have determined that's very important in terms of building support is your ability to appeal to the middle class. Most Americans are middle class or believe they're part of the middle class, even if economists would say they're probably not. So being able to communicate about the meat and potato issues, one of the things that Kamala Harris did in her introduction video is talking about working at McDonald's. That's a way of signaling that she was working class. She understands these everyday realities. So Kamala is trying to do that in various ways, and of course Trump is in various ways trying to depict her as African, Indian, liberal, communist. In other words, not an ordinary American, whereas he's a white male. So he's trying to do this as well in a slightly different way. Generally, what political scientists find is that when you have a lot of undecided voters, what's happening is that in kind of the last week of the campaign, suddenly there emerges a ballot question. This is the question on which voters are determining and they're casting their vote, and they will swing one way or another. So we don't know what that ballot question is because we're still not in these last 2 weeks. both candidates are trying very hard to frame each other and frame the election on this ballot question that favors them. So Kamala wants to talk about freedom and talk about the abortion issue. Trump is trying to frame the election around the economy because he believes that the hurt that so many Americans feel and the relative prosperity they had under his term will prejudice them to vote towards him. So there's a lot of things that can be involved. There's really no way to read the tea leaves, even of all the polls that we have. Another factor, which we know from George Lakoff and the political mind, is a lot of voters aren't actually rational. They don't vote on meat and potato issues. Many Republican voters vote for policies that are very detrimental to their benefits. Many of them are living on benefits which were, passed by, Democratic Congress. So in essence, one of the things that people do is they will vote their gut instinct, or they will vote for the person that they believe they would be comfortable with or that reflects their values. So this ends up being a calculation which can drive the election. And one of the things we're already seeing is that Kamala Harris is struggling more than Joe Biden with white working class males. They have a difficult time recognizing themselves in her and her life story. Oops. Despite a pretty polarized electorate, what we can see is that there have been kind of on the Electoral College side some lopsided results. Obama built a progressive coalition, making a breakthrough in traditionally Republican states, including like Indiana, Iowa, North Carolina, Ohio, on the road to a pretty substantial victory. One of the ways that he was able to do that was to appeal to whites. He got high turnout among African Americans as well. Now, Trump didn't win the popular vote, but he did win the electoral vote, and one of the ways that he was able to do that was by turning out whites that traditionally didn't vote a lot, especially in rural areas, and also doing better than expected among Latino voters. Biden's coalition is different than Obama's. He wasn't as popular, but unlike Hillary Clinton, he was able to appeal to white working class men in ways that enabled him to win the presidency, particularly by winning back the so-called blue wall states. So when it comes to winning an election, you have all these kind of micro groups. And depending on your candidate, they may appeal to certain groups more than others. And in a way, it's your ability to appeal to different groups, drive out turnout in different segments of it. One critical swing group is actually young voters. Older voters tend to be more reliable. They also tend to be more Republican. Generation Z voters, on the other hand, are much less reliable, much less likely to turn out, but also more liberal. So, like Obama, if Harris is able to get the enthusiasm up and get the Generation Z to turn out, most models would predict that she would win the election just on that basis. Often you'll hear pundits talk about the Hispanic vote, and the reason is because Hispanic is a category on the census, and it's the largest growing demographic in the United States. However, in my analysis, I don't think the Hispanic vote should be parceled into one uniform block because it's very different, diverse population. You have Puerto Ricans in New York City. You have a lot of Central Americans in California, a lot of Mexicans that migrated to Texas many generations ago. There's Cubans in Florida that tend to be very conservative. So, they might have, Hispanic heritage, But in terms of their political ideology, their class, and where they're located, their influence in various states, it's extremely different. One of the things, though, that perhaps is significant is that, generally speaking, Democrats attracted more of the Hispanic vote. And generally speaking, in the last 20 years, more and more Hispanic voters have gravitated towards the Republican Party. And Trump in particular has been able to appeal to some of those voters, and this was also a contributing factor to his victory in 2016 and his rise in the polls this time. Some speculate that this is really male Hispanic voters that have a difficult time voting for a woman, and also they identify with this type of machismo culture. I mean, he's really running an alpha male campaign, and that resonates potentially with this, or some in this group of male voters. Another thing which maybe isn't intuitive, that especially in places like Texas and other immigrant communities as well, those that are naturalized citizens are not necessarily in favor of more immigration. In fact, quite often they can be in favor of protecting the border. So the fear of illegal immigrants, which is a major narrative running through the vote, this also resonates with Hispanic voters. So if we look at the polls, we find that Harris and Trump are very closely matched, and it's been very closely matched from essentially the first week that Harris came into the campaign and traditional Democrats came back to her. On the other hand, when we break up the electorate, what we find is that there are big skews in terms of the support. So you can see among younger voters, the younger you are, the more you skew Democratic. The older you are, the more you skew slightly Republican. There's a big gender gap as well. And in some ways, the gender gap could be the driver of the election. Is Trump able to appeal to males, or is Kamala Harris able to control her margins? Is Kamala Harris able to use the abortion vote effectively to appeal to traditionally suburban Republican women? Generally, the results right now, which show Kamala slightly ahead, and I don't completely trust the polls, I'll explain in a minute, is that the gender gap slightly favors her in the sense that she's doing better among women than Trump is doing among men, and generally more women show up than men. There's a big educational gap as well. Generally, just slightly, but if you have a college education, you're white, you tend to be Democratic. If you don't have a college education, there's a pretty strong skew towards the Republicans. The largest skew in American politics is African American voters, which trend very highly towards the Democrats. However, Biden never appealed to the black demographic as well as previous candidates like Obama and the Clintons that had very strong connections with the African American community. As I was mentioning with Hispanic males, there are also African American males that the alpha male personality that Trump projects, that they take comfort in that. So we'll see to what extent Kamala Harris is able to secure the African American vote. 17% may not seem like a lot of the black vote, but if Trump is able to appeal to 19-20% in states like South Carolina, North Carolina, that can make a difference in the actual outcome. And he's been performing better among black voters than perhaps you would expect, given his often racist dog whistling. And the Hispanic voters, you can see the skew. It is Democratic, but not as strongly as it has been in the past. So the Democrats essentially have two pathways to victory. The blue wall strategy is simply to win Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. These are generally industrial states to a greater or lesser degree. They have a lot of white voters that are there. And essentially, Clinton lost the blue wall, which is why Trump won. So breaking the blue wall is essentially Trump's road to victory. And Biden used the blue wall strategy to beat Trump in 2020. But Biden also won Arizona and Georgia and came relatively close in North Carolina. These are Sunbelt states that are becoming increasingly democratic, partially because the population is aging and they're becoming younger, and they're attracting immigration from the northern states. So they're becoming bluer, but they're swing states still. Harris, because she's different than Biden, and because she's half African American, is flirting with a strategy of potentially getting a larger turnout, particularly in rural areas in Georgia and North Carolina. So if she's able to win Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina, and Biden narrowly lost North Carolina, she wouldn't have to use the blue wall strategy. She could simply win and get to 274 by doing the Sunbelt strategy, all things being equal. So in other words, Nevada and the first district of Nebraska going to the Democratic side. Now, it may be a mix of that. Harris has not been polling very well in Arizona for whatever reason. She's not polling as well in Nevada. She's also having trouble in Michigan and Pennsylvania. So it may be a combination of those strategies that's going to be necessary for her to win. Now, I've talked about the two pathways to Democratic victory, and there's a reason for that. If Trump wins, it will be probably what he's done before. He's able to draw out disaffected white voters, particularly from rural areas. If he wins Pennsylvania, not only is this the largest state, but it's suggesting that he's going to be very strong in Wisconsin and Michigan as well. And if he's able to get those blue wall states, he really just needs one of the Sunbelt states to come to victory. And he's really running neck and neck in these areas. So the race is really on an edge of a knife. Last week before the debate, Nate Silver, who's the best pollster in my opinion in the United States, gave Trump a 60% chance of winning the election. And you can see it's really here on a knife's edge. So the election's been very interesting. We never had that before, where a president dropped out right before the convention, and Harris was able to come in. I won't go over all the mechanisms that went into that. But what we can see since Biden dropped out is that Harris recovered the Democratic vote. And since then, it's been very, very close. There's been a few bumps along the way. The convention, she actually went up even before the convention. The convention just basically solidified and prevented Trump from speaking to the American people. She had her first TV interview, which didn't do much, and then she just had the first debate last Tuesday. We're waiting for the results on that. Most pollsters, most Americans believe she won the debate. But whether it was going to swing the voters is another matter. I looked at about 6 different focus groups, and although all these undecided voters thought she won the debate, they were disappointed that she didn't speak more about meat and potato issues, and they weren't necessarily convinced to vote for her yet. So we'll see what the polls say in the next week. But I think what we've already seen is that there's a very narrow band. This is the tightest a race has been as consistently as this for this long in U.S. electoral history, at least in the modern era. Now, you may think that, since Kamala Harris has generally in the last month been 2 to 3, even 5 points ahead of Trump, that she's going to win the election, that's relatively safe. But that can't be assumed as all. Most pollsters would tell you that for two reasons, Kamala Harris really needs to be at 4% lead nationally to be pretty confident about winning. First of all, this is because of the inbuilt advantage that Republicans have in the skew towards red states. So it seems very, very unlikely that Trump is going to win more votes than Kamala Harris. But because of this bias in the electoral system, he doesn't need to win as many popular votes. Another thing is that Trump has traditionally underperformed in polls. In fact, Trump is way outperforming the polls in the 2020 race with Biden. And relative to where the polls said his strength was, relative to the actual outcome, he was a lot stronger. And what this basically means, there was some speculation that there's these, shy Trump voters that don't dare say that they support him because they're embarrassed. But I've never met a shy Trump voter. It tends to be the opposite. What's really happening is the polls are based on models, and they're trying to anticipate who is there, and then they build up a demographic that reflects the electorate. And these models are different, and that's why these polls come up with different results. And what tends to happen is that with rural voters and the shift from landlines to cell phones, pollsters are having less success in reaching voters, particularly rural voters, so that they are not building enough Trump's rural support into their models. That's why when I see a poll where Kamala's ahead by 2 points, I am not at all confident that she's actually ahead. Traditionally, Trump is underpolled 2 to 3 percentage points. And so if Kamala's not 4% ahead nationally, that means in these swing states, she is essentially in a dead heat, and Trump might be underperforming, and that's why I think Nate Silver said that he had a 60% chance to win last week before the debate. So one of the keys to the election is going to be Pennsylvania. Everyone says that, and it's true. It's the Keystone State, by the way. Now, why is it significant? Well, just because it's so many electoral votes, but also because it's an indicator. Because if Kamala Harris wins Pennsylvania, it means that she probably won Michigan and Wisconsin as well. And if she wins the blue wall, she wins. So for her, it's very significant. At the same time, if Trump takes Pennsylvania, it means that his chances are he's performing well among rural white men, and he has a good chance of winning Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, Arizona as well. Now, Pennsylvania kind of typifies the American mosaic in the sense there's a very strong urban-rural divide. You can see it's very red in the sense of these rural areas. Trump's support is relatively strong. The darker the hue, the stronger the support. There are a few kind of semi-urban areas with medium-sized towns where the Democrats poll better. But for the Democrats, generally they do very well in Philadelphia and its suburbs. The urban areas have become more and more blue, particularly under Trump, where traditionally fiscally conservative Republicans have a hard time voting for Trump, and they increasingly are skewing Democratic. So, we don't know how this is all going to go. The polls are very, very tight. If we look at it in the past, the state was already very tight. It swung to Trump in 2016. Otherwise, it's been mostly in the Democratic camp. But there's a clear drift of rural voters towards Republicans over the last 20 years. It's a state that has a Democratic governor that's super popular. On the other hand, there's also a lot of support for Trump. So what's going to really determine Pennsylvania, I think, is particularly the turnout in the Philadelphia suburbs. Kamala Harris needs a huge turnout, particularly among millennial and Generation Z voters. She's also doing an interesting rural strategy. Unlike Democratic candidates in the past, Hillary Clinton never left Philadelphia. Both Tim Walz, who was a white man from kind of a farm boy from Nebraska, they're sending him into these rural counties. Kamala's going in these counties, and what they're trying to do is to depress Trump's margins, appeal to these working class men. But there's some indications that she's struggling to do that. So I have no idea where Pennsylvania is going to go. I really get the sense that this is the tightest state of them all, and it is the keystone to the whole election, which makes it very difficult for me to call or to predict how this election is going to turn out. The second big key, which is very hard to measure, is enthusiasm. So enthusiasm means that you really are excited about your candidate. You've probably heard Donald Trump talking about his crowd size, and Kamala Harris needling him about his crowd size and his crowds leaving his events. But what enthusiasm means is that there's always a split between someone who's registered Democrat or Republican versus someone that's going to show up to the polls. So enthusiastic voters are more likely to show up to the polls. Enthusiasm is, of course, important for both sides. I would argue it's more important for a Democratic candidate because they have a larger pool of voters and a larger pool of voters that are traditionally less loyal. So the more enthusiastic they are, the better the Democrats do. And Kamala Harris is surrounded by a lot of Obama people, and they're running a kind of a similar campaign. I don't think Kamala Harris is quite as charismatic or as popular as Barack Obama, but she's running a similar style campaign, trying to get excitement among Generation Z voters and also trying to drive out turnout. Now, we do know that in 2022, after abortion was outlawed in the Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision, that this had a huge effect. Like even in very Republican states like Kansas, the Republicans were losing in this the so-called red wave in the 2022 midterms never materialized. So there's good indication that voters are pretty enthusiastic about Harris ever since the convention. You have, Taylor Swift even endorsing her. You have Oprah Winfrey, the Obamas that came out. So she's trying to rebuild that Obama coalition that won in a landslide. On the other hand, if we look at the enthusiasm, the Trump voters are a little less enthusiastic. But I think Trump's support is a little bit more fragile. One of the things that Kamala really hammered him on the debate, and a lot of swing voters and undecided voters complained that she didn't talk more about policy and the meat and potato issues. But she really made the point that he's all in it for himself. So there's some indication of Trump fatigue. People know that he's kind of a narcissist, and if she can make that stick, that potentially could lower the turnout. Traditionally, Trump has outperformed the polls because he gets untraditional, underclass white voters to turn up for him. They have this almost cultish devotion to him. If that spell is broken, the magic of the Trump brand, Kamala Harris could start to win a lot of states, and it could look a lot more like a landslide. I have seen Democratic activists in Florida, which is a red state now, by the way. It was originally purple, but in the last 3 elections, it's been pretty solidly Republican. But they were saying that the abortion issue, you can't underestimate this. So I don't know. I don't know to what extent pollsters are building this into their model, to what extent Republican women would be single-issue voters on abortion, that this could swing states in ways that we didn't anticipate. It's possible. I don't know. But right now, what I see is that the enthusiasm is relatively equal. And this could change. I think enthusiasm for Trump could wane. I guess Something could happen to Harris too in the next 2 months. But right now, the enthusiasm is probably the Democrats' best hope. If they have more volunteers, if they sign up more voters, if they can register more, if they can drive them to the polls, that's what they need to do to win the election. So there's some other X factors as well that are going to actually drive the election. One is that Harris is raising more money than Trump. And she's also attracting, just when she came in, the amount of volunteers that she got and the excitement of that. So I think that was a very significant change. But on the other hand, if you look at it from, say, January to July, the Republican ground game was a lot more ferocious. They registered a lot more voters in places like Pennsylvania. They had 600,000 new voters added to the Republican rolls. Now, some people might say, well, these were simply independents that wanted to vote in the closed primary. That's possibly a factor. What we have seen since Harris came on board is that the Democratic registrations are really through the roof, particularly among young voters, women voters, Hispanic voter. All of these demographics show huge increases. So if that is true and these voters come to the polls, that could make a big difference. There's very low turnout in U.S. elections, so whenever there's more turnout, the Democrats tend to benefit because they have a larger pool of voters, and their turnout tends to be lower. One of the things I think that Kamala Harris is struggling with is, she would be the first woman president. She'd be the first Asian president. She would be the first African American president. And, 66% of the American voters are white. And, some people, especially men, are going to have a difficult time feeling comfortable with her. She hasn't run like Hillary Clinton as a woman or played that edge. She's tried to make voters comfortable with her. But I have noticed in the various polls, if you look at the white men in the blue wall states, she's actually not doing as well as Biden. Now, she's making up for that by attracting younger voters, African American voters, and that's making North Carolina competitive. But she's tracking weaker than Biden did in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania at this stage of the race. And those are states that Biden barely won. He didn't win them by very large margins. Now, there are some other factors as well. In Arizona, there's an abortion referendum on the agenda. So that could bring women to the polls, which seems to help Democrats. The North Carolina is in play largely because the governor, the Republican candidate for governor, is so out of this world that it's going to increase turnout, which a lot of people think will help the Democrats. There's been a 20-year campaign to suppress voters. So if you go to cities like Cleveland, the African American voters have to stand in line for 4 or 5 hours, and there's gunmen by drop-off boxes when people are trying to drop off their vote. And there's been various efforts in Florida and Texas to take people off the rolls, challenge their credentials, force them to have various forms of identification. If you have different sounding names. I can't get into all the shenanigans because there's been hundreds of different measures. This is essentially the Republican strategy to be competitive in these elections, since the voters are skewing away from them on the issues. They're trying to reduce the Democratic voter pool or dissuade them from coming out to vote. Georgia did a very interesting thing where essentially Trump election deniers were appointed to a local board, and they're going to certify the elections, which is very, very troubling. You can't have partisan people in the electoral process, and this is all unresolved. In theory, if you had a strong court system, a reliable Supreme Court, you could appeal this. But we've already seen Trump's efforts to pollute the process by which votes are tabulated. Just wanted to briefly talk about foreign interference. One of the keys to Trump's victory, and there were a few. Comey violating FBI protocols to bring up the email thing when there was contacts between Trump and the Russians. It's very troubling that the FBI would intervene in the election. But there was also this very significant transfer of electoral data with essentially voter data in Facebook, and using that to create very targeted ads, essentially micro-targeted ads. I can't get into the whole case of this. This would essentially be in a 1-hour lecture just on itself. But obviously, Russia's fighting a war in Ukraine. They are not going to be able to win it on the ground. The way they're going to win the war is basically to cut off Ukraine's support from Western states. So one of the ways that they've done that is intervene in U.S. elections, Brexit, and other elections. And this Russian disinformation is still there. And, there'll be later studies on what's going on right now, but we can definitely see when we're thinking about the skew of, white rural voters, low information voters, many of them have ideas which are, out of keeping with reality. And some of them, this is disinformation that is partially contributing to this distortion. The other thing, to keep in mind is that when you look at successful coups or military dictatorships that happen in democracies, they don't necessarily succeed at the first time. They tend to move in kind of slow motion. They chip away at the democratic edifice over time. And one of the things that we can see is that after Trump lost the election in 2020, he used various forms of influence to try to seize power. He went through a whole bunch of attorney generals trying to use the legal process to corrupt the voter total. He changed his Secretary of Defense as well to find someone who would be pliable to his coup d'etat. He set up fake electors in various states like Arizona and Georgia, and his idea was to throw the validity of the outcome into question, and then send these fake electors to elect him. And his vice president in the Constitution, it's his role to acknowledge the results of the state. And essentially what he was asking Mike Pence to do is to question the results so he could bring in these fake electors and then claim that he was still president and launch a coup d'etat. Mike Pence refused, and that's why the gallows gang was here trying to hang him, and why they were storming the Capitol to prevent the certification of Biden's victory. So he made various calls. He called the Secretary of State in Georgia, where he told him, Raffensperger, find me 10,500 votes. And he made similar calls to other states, Arizona, Michigan. He called a local official, and this Republican refused. I'm not going to violate my oath of office. So there was resistance among this tradition of democracy in the United States. Local officials, often Republican, accepted their nonpartisan role and refused to corrupt the process. But the system in the United States is much, much weaker now. It's been attacked. Trump is already talking. If he doesn't win the election, he won't accept it if he doesn't win. And his supporters are already saying, threatening civil war. They have all these phrases like, kill yourself now so we don't have to waste our ammo. So this is very violent talk in these darker circles of the United States. Now, the reason that's important is because the outcome is not necessarily democratic, right? In some sense, we might see some kind of civil war if Trump contests the election, or he's actively working to corrupt the electoral process in certain key states like Georgia, which, if the margin is narrow enough, may enable him to get the math to 270. And we have to talk about the Supreme Court. If you think that the Supreme Court would intervene to prevent Trump from corrupting the process, you don't know your history. Because in 2000, in Florida, The Supreme Court made a decision which American law schools still to this date cannot explain. They essentially launched a coup d'etat, stopped a recount, and gave the vote to Bush. And since then, the degree to which the Supreme Court has become corrupted, and either the influence of very wealthy people's money, even Supreme Court Thomas accepting a yacht trip from Russia, and the various ways in which they're connected to the Republican Party, that we can have no confidence in the Supreme Court to give a valid decision. They've now become politicized, corrupted by Trump and previous Republican presidents. So to conclude, arguably this is the most important election in most Americans' lifetime, and I would argue for Canadians as well. In some sense, whether Trump gets elected in Washington may be more significant than who gets elected in Parliament in the next election, just given the extreme weight of the U.S. economy and the threat to Canadian sovereignty if there is a hostile nationalistic force in Washington. This race is incredibly close, historically close. This is a reflection of the depolarization, as I explained, which makes it very difficult to know who's going to win the election. And the election winner will not be the person who gets the most votes. Kamala Harris is going to get the most votes. It's not even necessarily going to be the candidate who gets the most electoral votes. If the process is corrupted, and we know the courts are corrupted, we know that Trump is corrupting the political process in various ways, either by repressing votes or by corrupting the process by which they are certified. Trump has made it very clear he will not accept any loss, and his supporters are preaching the same thing. They've already launched a violent riot on Congress. I think we can expect in a sequel conflict he's going to incite them to violence, and who knows how that is going to turn out. Now, if Trump is defeated, I think that the Republican Party is going to be very much changed. The Republican Party has now been dominated by Trumpism. It's a type of cult. They've strayed from their values. He would have lost, essentially 2 elections. It's going to force a dramatic change and a soul-searching for the Republican Party. And it may take, if we look at history, several party cycles before the Republicans are restored as a brand with a new mission.